So, I mean, the testing here shows that there is a variant in a different gene for you that is of unknown significance, okay? And this is not uncommon at all with genetic testing. According to this report, this has not been reported, this variant that you have has not been reported previously, and that's one of the reasons it is unknown as to what its significance is, okay? Now, having said that, the gene that this is associated with usually has, if there is an association, in other words, your specific gene change has not been reported before, but this gene is implicated in a couple of different myopathy problems, which are congenital myopathy issues, okay? Now, these two things, one is an arthrogryposis multiplex congenita, which you clearly do not have because, well, for all reasons in terms of presentation of that. And the other would be an autosomal recessive Nemeline myopathy, which doesn't fit you either, okay? Because your biopsy didn't show Nemelin rods. And if you were to have had this would have been a congenital issue. You would have had issues from birth, okay? And so it doesn't fit the underlying diagnosis that you have had from the workup that you have had, okay? And I went back and looked at, and actually the first time you and I met, in terms of the review of the biopsy you had, and there was some concern as to whether you may have a different type of, muscular dystrophy back at that time, but that didn't pan out either, okay? And a second review of your biopsy was clearly put it as an IBM change in the muscle itself. So where we have this is to suggest that given the variation that you have in the gene, it most likely doesn't have any particular significance in your situation, because if it did, we would expect it would be these other problems which don't fit your course at all, okay? Of course, the other reality with gene testing is, that there are so many genes that, and we don't necessarily know what they do, okay? There's no reference that we can go to and say, okay, we're going to hone in on this one gene, okay? And if it hasn't been determined to be associated with a particular physical characteristic or a disease process or otherwise, then I don't know what it does, okay? And how they started figuring these things out, for example, we go back to when they determined that with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is a very severe muscular dystrophy that affects boys, okay, they didn't know for a very, very long time exactly what the protein problem was in the muscle. And what they ended up doing is they ended up taking samples of people that clearly had this disease, and then when they started to be able to look at and to identify genes, they basically tried to match up, okay, what are we seeing here that's different than the regular population that, we see always in someone who has this. And so this is how they figured all this out over time. Again, there's no, reference to go to say what, it's a comparison of what we know about people and what the genes, changes that they have, so that we can match those up. And so this is why in your situation, yes, this is a variant from what is normally seen, but it's unclear as to exactly what it's doing or not doing for you, okay? And as far as that goes, the gene that your sister has an issue with, you don't have an issue with.
Right.
Okay, so in that case, this is a little bit of a red herring in a sense that, and again, it's very common to see this sort of thing with gene testing. And go back a few years, we couldn't test for any of these things. Okay, as time goes forward, we'll be testing for more and more and more things, and it's these changes of unknown significance that come up over time that helps the research people try to figure out, okay, this is different for you. We haven't seen this before, but lacking a genetically determined disease process, we don't know what it means.
Right. So it's likely that whatever this is, that isn't connected to the IVM is not going to affect my children. Right.
I would say unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
We can't say absolutely for sure because we don't know for sure what the significance is.
Right.
Having identified this, however, if your children were to have issues of some sort, they could always be tested to see if they have this.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the sort of thing that builds a case, if you will,
I see.
for whether this gene change that you have is something that's bad or not.
Uh-huh.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to know. It's important for you to talk to your kids about this.
Yes.
Should they develop some issue? Now, once again, from what we know of what this gene does in muscle disease, if your kids had a problem with that type of muscle disease, you would have known this
Right.
way back.
They're in their 40s now.
Right,
so.
right. And you know, we're talking pretty significant changes with these other problems, okay? To the degree that the Mendel and rod myopathy can be very severe in infancy to the point of non-survival,
Right.
okay?
Right.
And the arthrogryposis change is also quite significant because it creates unfortunate physical deformities.
I see.
Okay, so good thing to say is that for what we know, this gene, when people have a particular problem, not the one you have, but another problem with the gene that they can identify and say, yeah, well, those patients, generally speaking, they're going to have problems from infancy. Your kids haven't had that.
No.
The chances of this being related to that are very, very slim.
Good.
At the same time, again, we don't know because of the not being reported before.
Yes.
They possibly, you know, there might be something. I mean, that gene does something that isn't, you know, this problem, the problems we just discussed, because you have a variant in it and you don't have those problems.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, one of the things about genes is that they don't necessarily stand alone in the sense that oftentimes disease processes that are hereditarily determined, there may be a primary gene change, but it's a constellation of other factors that create what you see in the patient in terms of a disease state. For example, with going back to Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there is a very mild form of Duchenne muscular dystrophy known as Becker muscular dystrophy. It was thought forever to be just a totally different entity.
Mm-hmm.
Now we know it's exactly the same problem, but the issue is that those that have the Becker dystrophy, which is very mild, their gene changes in a portion of the gene that doesn't cause a big problem in the muscle.
Uh-huh.
But, you know, so as you can see, the significance, and it's clear also that there may be modifiers of other genes in concert, if you will, with the primary thing that may cause more or less of an issue for patients.
More complicated.
Right, it's, you know, and you think about, you know, gene testing, oh, well, you either have it or you don't. Well, it's not exactly that simple as most things aren't. But from my perspective, this is, I think it's good news. Okay.
Yes, yes.
And so, and I, you know, from my perspective also, I don't think that, you know, we need to do further testing or otherwise at this point. And with your kids, I wouldn't suggest, unless they were to develop some problem, that there was an unclear, you know, unclear what it was or what was causing it. I wouldn't think that they would need to be tested either.
Good,
Okay.
good. That's what I was wondering
Yeah.
about.
So that's our story.
Great.